and also I will stop sharing the poster. Karin.
Yes, thank you, Cornelia. As Cornelia mentioned, we do this seminar series, this speaker series at the Center for Geomedia Studies here at Karlstad University. And we have a mix of physical presentations and also sometimes online presentations. And today, as you know, we have a panel, which we are very excited about. It's on digital work geographies, as Cornelia said. And this panel acknowledges that work is undergoing a lot of changes, and partly, but not only, of course, due to technological transformations. And this seminar brings together leading scholars in the field to discuss how work and workplaces are currently impacted by digital media, and paying particular attention to digitalization's or mediatization's effect on the geographies of work, and also how we perceive of those geographies potentially. So we have very interesting topics today, ranging from platforms as workplaces and the workplace as an infrastructure, the revival of craft work and the search or quest for meaning in today's digitalized work geographies, and also the digital nomad movement, and more specifically insights from a digital nomad's cruise. All of this sounds really intriguing, I think. And we are very honored to have 3 prominent scholars in this field presenting today, and I will very soon introduce each of them. But just a quick note on the format. So each presenter will have around 20 minutes to present their research. And we think that it might be a good idea to have 2 presenters first and then take a very short break of 5 minutes or so if you want to get some coffee or go to the restroom. And then we will do the last presentation, and then we will have a joint discussion afterwards. So we will collect all the questions and discussion until the last section of this panel. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. So first out, we will do it in the order as in the program. So first out is Lizzie Richardson, who is an economic and cultural geographer researching and teaching at Goethe University in Frankfurt, where she holds a position of Professor of Digital Geography and is also a member of the Interdisciplinary Laboratory for Studies of Science and Technology. And her research, as I'm sure many of you know, predominantly focuses on the intersections between the geographies of work and technology, and mainly then digital technology, perhaps. And she will talk on the topic of platforms as workplaces and the geographies of digital work. And next up then, we are very happy also to have Alessandro Gandini here, who is an associate professor of cultural sociology at the University of Milan, Department of Social and Political Sciences. And his research deals with the relationship between technology and society, with a specific focus on digital work cultures and also digital methods. And Alessandro will talk about meaningful work after the middle class, also very interesting topic. And then last but not least, we have our long-term Geomedia friend, Erika Paulsson, who is an associate professor in the Department of Media, Film and Journalism Studies at the University of Denver. Her research engages critical cultural perspectives on digital media, mobility and placemaking. And Erika will talk on the topic of a global sense of workplace on the emerging infrastructure for digital nomads. And already the titles of these presentations indicates that there is quite a coherence in terms of the topic. So we are very excited again to have you all here, and without further ado, I will then let Lizzie have the word. And we have already tested that the sharing mode works. So yes, welcome, Lizzie.
Can you see the slides?
Perfect.
Okay. it's been a while since I did a presentation online, so it's back to the slightly strange experience. Yeah, thanks very much. We don't have very much time, so I'm not going to give a large kind of introduction, but thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations and the discussion. So my contribution, I guess, to the discussion on digital work geographies is really revolving around two questions. So what are geographies of work with digital technologies? And secondly, why does this matter? So the first question considers whether there is some kind of shared spatial form or pattern across quite different types of work with digital technologies. And the second question addresses if or why such geographies of work with digital technologies might be important. What does this spatial dimension tell us or reveal? Hopefully these questions will make a bit more sense as I go through the presentation. And I just want to say that my comments, in order to not sound too universalizing, my comments are based on empirical research in the UK context. And in order to provide some kind of grounding for discussion of these questions, I want to focus on the platform. And although platforms in the social sciences tend to be understood as online, or at least often as software, much research, including in media studies, but also in sociology and human geography, amongst others, has emphasized how platforms are material and materializing. So produced through different kind of physical elements, and also themselves creating distinctive physical arrangements in terms of for example, people, vehicles, and so on. And specifically, I want to suggest that it's helpful to consider the platform as a workplace in order to address the question of what are the geographies of digital work. So tracing how the platform is a workplace aids in understanding the geographies of work with digital technologies. What exactly is a workplace with digital technologies, meaning not only how has the location of work changed, but also in turn how the construction and experience of place has altered with and through these technologies. So my kind of broad or overall kind of argument or statement, I guess, is that platforms, and we could maybe say digital technologies more broadly, platforms require a shift from an imaginary of the workplace as a more or less fixed site towards an approach that sees the workplace as an infrastructure that might have a more shifting or relational spatial form. And this is on the one hand, a relatively simple and intuitive point, I think, but on the other hand, is slightly more complex and raises a number of different kind of issues if we kind of try to take this statement seriously. So before elaborating on this, I want to just sort of talk a little bit more about the platform. And I think it makes sense to address the geographies of digital work through the platform, because platforms exist as a kind of archetypal media and economic form for work in the digital era. The platform gets at exactly this kind of complicated relationship between software and hardware, between the physical and the virtual of the digital workplace, or what could be called the kind of contemporary mediatization of work, in which the workplace is both always kind of there, but not directly so. So we have this sense of the workplace as kind of everywhere and nowhere. And I think it's, of course, worth highlighting that actually, like the term digital work, the term platform is a rather slippery one. It means different things in different contexts, what Tarleton Gillespie in 2010 called a structural metaphor. So it's not always easy to kind of see a platform. It might mean different things in different contexts. And in relation to work, we could think of the platform variously as some combination of a kind of intervening substance, a means of doing something, or as a kind of vehicle or container for storage with the intention of transmission. And so just to elaborate briefly on these, as an intervening substance, this is perhaps most intuitively understood as a kind of labour market intermediary. So platforms function as something through which jobs are distributed from a job giver to a job receiver. The kind of classic example of this is what's called crowd work, so through platforms such as Upwork. And then as a means of doing something, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. And then as a kind of means of doing something, we can kind of think of a platform as a tool for undertaking a job, but maybe not in a sort of conventional sense. So platforms have often kind of created work where it wasn't there previously. So a kind of means of doing something in that sense. So a good example of this is delivery platforms that have created logistics work in sectors or for services where it did not previously exist to the same extent. And so in my own research, I looked at kind of food delivery platforms in this context. And then as a kind of a storage vehicle or other kind of basis for transmission, here we can think of what are sometimes referred to as the kind of background platforms or essential platforms, those identified by Nick Cernacek, which provide the basis upon which other kind of platform-based services operate. So a platform like Google that provides various data mapping and other services. So we have this this idea of a platform or platforms as somehow providing materials for work. So we can already see then that when we talk about platforms and work, we're not talking about one thing. So platforms then indicate this kind of variety of types of interaction between digital technologies and practices of work, and thus by extension the different geographies of work. And I want to really highlight two significant geographical elements to work through platforms. And the first is that work frequently does not have to take place at a fixed workplace. And in my own research, I have looked a number of different points at office work. So office work no longer has to take place at a designated office building, depending on the conditions of work and so on. And then secondly, forms of movement become part of the work activity itself. And most, again, most obviously here is perhaps forms of logistical work, but we can think also of the way in which the lack of fixed workplace requires certain types of movement to construct a workplace as well. So we have this kind of forms of movement to construct a workplace and within the practices of work. And I think a couple of important contextualizing points concerning these geographies. One is that they do not have a direct or fixed relationship with the conditions of work. So movement in work does not necessarily indicate, for example, greater autonomy for the worker. And these geographies do not have a kind of clear or fixed relationship with income. So movement may or may not occur in low-income jobs and the same in high-income jobs. And then the other point I would just make is that this is not a claim to novelty in any absolute sense. Forms of movement have always been part of different types of work, and equally the notion of a fixed workplace outside of the home is itself one that is primarily associated in the UK context with industrial capitalism. So if there is a shift away from a fixed workplace, we would of course have to ask for whom and in what kind of time period. So an implication then of this understanding of the workplace, An implication of this is then that an understanding of the workplace as a fixed site is no longer necessarily useful for approaching how work takes place. And so instead of looking at a fixed location for work then, it's rather better, I would like to suggest, to look instead at the ways in which workspace is made flexible through platforms. And I think here we have a kind of geographical or spatial echo of other political economic discourses around flexibility that have, of course, been in existence, or discourses and political practices around flexibility that have been in existence since the 1980s. So we can say that, in fact, a geographical condition of flexibility is somewhat essential to platform labour or work. And this flexibility means, on the one hand, new capacities of space through internal variation. So this geographical condition of flexibility. So platforms make existing space perform differently to allow or to produce for novelty. So flexibility here implies not simply finding a new location, nor solely considering the geographical dispersal of work, but rather finding novel ways to differentiate within space. Such as, for example, in my own research, making commercial office space flexible, or, for example, connecting previously disconnected urban sites, as with food delivery platforms. And then, in addition to this internal spatial variation, the other kind of element of this geographical condition of flexibility is a kind of a spatial experience of mobility that is highly differentiated for its composite actors, so for those who are involved in this mobility. And this is really important. So although work might involve forms of movement or space-time coordination, this is felt for some as more coercive and for others as more chosen. A simple example of this is in the arrangement of food delivery work, in which the delivery worker must necessarily do more work to produce space-time coordination than the restaurant or the customer. And then kind of equally, I guess it's important to emphasize that flexibility as a kind of spatial structure, if we want to think of it like that, is frequently composed by a good deal of fixity for certain actors in this spatial structure. So we're not simply talking about everything moving around all the time. In combination, then, these two spatial processes indicate how geographies, specifically of flexibility, are shaping digital work, but at the same time as the basic spatial category of the workplace that implicitly underpins such an analysis is itself being altered through platforms. So this leaves us then with the question of what geographical unit should we focus on in order to make sense of this flexibility? If the digital era is constituted by a geographical condition of flexibility, but the kind of materiality of space itself is changing with digital technologies, then we need a kind of analytic of spatial forms or patterns to understand social structure that does not rely on place as a static location. So on one level, these kind of changing geographies associated with platforms provoke these sort of rather abstract structural questions. But as is hopefully indicated by the questions on the slide, they also raise the seemingly more simple issue of how to understand where work takes place, the geographies of work, when there is no fixed workplace. What kind of a location is the workplace in this context? And a proposed answer, I mean, I guess my proposed answer, but other people's as well, a proposed answer to this is infrastructure. So we can understand where work takes place through a focus on infrastructure rather than on site. So in this thesis, it is infrastructure that provides a location for work when working activity is kind of spatially flexible. And indeed, we can think of the workplace of the platform then not as kind of fixed sites, but as infrastructure. But what in particular are we looking at when we look at infrastructure, and what exactly can this show? Well, we're certainly looking at, on the one hand, kind of concrete, sometimes territorially fixed technologies and materials. So in the case of digital work, this could mean an office building, a laptop, data center, and so on. But we're also looking at, on the other hand, processes and practices of circulation and distribution, which is what gives infrastructure, in this perspective, a kind of different spatiality. So although an infrastructure might be composed of specific sites, what constitutes it as an infrastructure is that it enables movement, it produces circulation. So in the case of digital work, we're looking at infrastructure as the practices and processes that enable flexible location of work, and also, equally importantly, kind of require spatial flexibility as part of the work process. So, for example, we could think here of processes of arrangement and coordination. And it's really this kind of second perspective on infrastructure that I want to emphasize here. And because of time, and also it's probably not appropriate to go into it in this kind of presentation format, I just want to summarize, hopefully the slide is also useful, to summarize this approach very briefly before suggesting what it implies for the geographies of digital work through the platform. So this then is an understanding of infrastructure as practices that resolve the tension between standards and their enactment. So it therefore kind of allows for an examination of how autonomous movement as part of flexibility is enabled, but also emphasizes how this autonomy is somehow structured by certain standards. So in this sense, then, infrastructure enables both an analysis of structure, but also an attention to the action of structuring, to the kind of contingencies that compose all standards and norms. Or, as is often said in the case of infrastructure, the kind of hidden work that enables the real work to appear as such. Making infrastructure a focus of inquiry then draws attention to conditions of visibility. It shows how a particular site, substance, or activity is made visible. And so in shifting potentially the conditions of visibility, infrastructure provides a different way of constructing what a problem or situation is, and therefore the possibilities for intervention in that situation. So framing digital work through infrastructure can or opens up the possibility of thinking about what digital work is from a different perspective. Okay, so with this approach to infrastructure in mind, we can return to the questions that I wanted to address at the beginning of the presentation. So when answering what are the geographies of digital work through the platform, the emphasis here has been on the notion of spatial flexibility, a structure that always also includes elements of fixity, but nonetheless requires a more kind of relational approach to space, one that can be understood through infrastructure. So the platform workplace is usefully approached for its infrastructural qualities rather than by focusing on it as a fixed or defined site. If the geographies of digital work thus revolve or can revolve around an analysis of infrastructure, the question of why this matters remains. Why does spatial flexibility matter socially or economically? And relatedly, what is to be gained by studying platform workplaces as infrastructures? And I really want to just briefly point to three key areas where this matters. And the first is perhaps most intuitively thinking about worker agency and control. Now, infrastructures and geographies of spatial flexibility, I would suggest, necessitate a nuanced understanding of digital technologies in work that allows both for high degrees of autonomy on the part of workers, together with the possibility for greater degrees of control of workers and to some extent by workers through the technology. And indeed, elements of autonomy for workers and elements of control of workers can occur simultaneously through platform workplaces. And I've just illustrated this here with a platform photo of platform delivery workers in Newcastle, which of course are, we could say, on the more highly controlled end of platform work, but they nonetheless have various, we could say, degrees of autonomy or freedom in the working activity itself and in their kind of possibility or capacity to decide to work or not. I think the key point in relation to worker agency and control when thinking about infrastructure is that this is not an account of direct technological control. It asks for a more complex and nuanced understanding of the relationship between technology and, I guess, worker agency. And then secondly, the workplace's infrastructure approach has implications for how we understand work as part of a social structure, or work's role in composing social structure. So infrastructures enable work to take place, but may also allow other activities to take place with other actors and agencies. Focusing on infrastructure enables an understanding then of how boundaries of work are configured and reconfigured, as well as highlighting the other actors and activities that intersect with, facilitate, or run simultaneously to work. So in other words, the infrastructure of platforms might not always nor singularly be used as a workplace. And an example of this is the so-called personal productivity apps. I just have an illustration here, kind of calendars, scheduling, to-do lists, and so on, that can be used just as easily on handheld mobile devices for work as for other activities. And this is what Melissa Gregg has called a kind of personal logistics, in which instead of the company or the organization bearing the burden of coordinating time and place, the impetus or imperative is now kind of falling on everyone to use time resourcefully and to be in the right place at the right time. And this encourages us then to think about flexible social structure through who or what has the capacity to coordinate, and who or what is rather on the receiving end of this. So who or what is being coordinated, both in and outside of paid labour. And then thirdly, as well as this kind of different actors implicated in or kind of outside or around the boundaries of work, infrastructure also indicates the different interests in work and work taking place, including the various modes of valuation of work and workspace that go beyond the attribution of value through the wage relation. Now, this could include financial valuation of infrastructural elements of flexibility, but also draws attention, I think, to the intricate relationship between activities outside of the wage relation and wage labour. So how flexibility takes on certain kind of social values. And a good example of this is the way in which digital technologies have affected the valuation of office space. And I just want to highlight two aspects of this here very, very briefly. Firstly, because office work can itself be geographically mobile thanks to digital technologies, this has required new ways of selling and thus valuing office space based on its flexibility. So on what it does rather than purely on kind of square meters. And this is usually understood through a vocabulary of kind of workplace experience. Secondly, digital technologies have also created new ways of measuring and monitoring office space performance. So this performance in terms of workplace experience performance, but also environmental standards, data on building usage, and so on, that can feed into asset measurement. Okay, so to kind of briefly conclude then, the geographies of digital work can be understood through the platform, not just, but they can be understood through the platform, which invites a focus on the workplace as infrastructure rather than as a more or less kind of fixed and independent site. The geographical flexibility of work through digital technologies is better understood through a kind of relational approach to space rather than one that sees place as fixed or space as kind of contained. And this spatial approach to infrastructure thus shows how a focus on geographies of digital work help to address and unpack some of the pressing issues concerning digital work more generally. So namely the degree of autonomy that workers have, the kind of types of actors and agencies involved in work processes and delimiting kind of the boundaries of work and thus the kind of changing role of work in social structure. And then finally, the kind of shifting economic and social value of work and working activity in the digital era. And I will stop sharing and leave it there. Hopefully roughly to time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lizzie. That was perfect timekeeping, I would say. And without knowing too much about the exact content of your presentation, Alessandro, I suppose that there are some, it pretty much perhaps continues where Elizabeth or Lizzie ended with talking about the value of work. So maybe that's a smooth transition. I leave the floor to you, Alessandro. And we have already tested.
Can you see the slides? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. It's always quite difficult to follow on from Lizzie. I am such an admirer of her work and find it great, so I'll do my best to keep up with it. I'm trying to figure out how, maybe now it's full screen. That works better, right? Cool. So yes, in many ways, my work here, my presentation here follows on Lizzie's work, but we are going to be heading into a different direction. And I guess that's also partly because of the topic that I'm following on, that I'm studying on in particular, which is what you also introduced as a kind of revival of craft work. That I locate in the context of this emergent digital economy. Just very briefly, as you mentioned, I've been involved in studying new forms of work for a while now. The latest endeavor is exactly this ERC project that I am the coordinator of, and it was awarded an ERC starting grant in 2020 during the pandemic, which is focused on this revival of craft work. And the main research question, the overarching research question, is to try and scope out the paradoxical resurgence of craft work in precisely one of the moments, possibly the most intense moment of technological advancement that we have been living in the context of work for a while now. And the concepts that main concept, I guess, I am drawing for this endeavor is the role of identity, which throughout the project, we are halfway through now, exactly halfway through, this has been sort of turning into an inquest on meaning and the meaning of work, and why do people work, kind of cross-sex different types of work also that I have studied in the past. The books that you can see in a shameless self-promoting slide are also related to other types of work which are closer to what Lizzie's just talked about, from freelance work to the gig economy. And again, I guess the broad context in which I operate is this idea that we are moving into a transition from post-Fordism and industrial capitalism into something else that also transcends the rise and, to an extent, the demise of neoliberalism and neoliberal world cultures, which are quite important, I think, to keep in mind, because they explain some of this trajectory and some of the reasons why we've come to this point. And again, the two new elements that I think come to the fore as a result of this story, and that my project in many ways, hopefully, will try to say something about at the end, not of this presentation, but at the end of the project. At the end of this presentation, there are some intermediary findings, let's say, one thing that actually speaks very well to what Lizzie just said, so the linking of the execution of work from space and time. The focus on space in Lizzie's presentations was particularly evident. I think also time is something that we should start thinking about in some way. And there are some forms of new work, not necessarily craft work, but also craft work in some way, that speak to this reconfiguration of space and time in the way we work, which is quite the sort of long trend problem that we're gonna face, I guess, and that we move into in the years to come. And more chiefly to the current work that I'm doing, as I said, the project builds on the understanding that we are faced with a renewed question around the meaning of work, especially after the pandemic. I wrote this project, and it was funded in the middle of the pandemic. The project was actually written before that. So in my mind, the sort of overarching question is, would it have been different if in the absence of a global pandemic that has brought to the fore this question even more? But that's where we are. So I guess I have to let this question go and build on this assumption, let's say. Sorry, my PowerPoint just messes up. So meaningful work, why this has become newly important? Well, I'm not the only one or the first one to talk about it. There is an amazing book by Lazar and Carlson, if you're familiar with their work, that restarted this conversation. Mostly, however, focusing on meaningful waged work. But my starting point is not necessarily that one. It's a little earlier, and has been the work of David Graeber, who I guess needs no introduction, who was among the first one to essentially point to this idea of meaningfulness as a key to understand some of the most recent evolution into work and work practices. And throughout my work, I think this idea of meaning resonated very well for two concepts, essentially. One that was already in my work, the idea that we are moving into a post-employment society, so a society where there is a lot of work, but not many jobs. And on the other hand, trying to understand the new forms of work that I've always studied for a while, for a long time now, and what do they have in common? And how can we keep together within a relatively common framework things that are potentially very different from one another, that may or may not involve technology and platforms and digital media in general in different ways, but that I still felt had something that kept them together at the level, at least, of the cultural conception of work. What is that these different practices actually say to the meaning of work, and how do people feel and relate about work? How do workers do, and not only, of course, not only workers, but especially workers here in this way. And that's what brought me to this weird picture that pretty much sums up what I have in my head at the moment. That is sort of rendition of what I find the sort of scope of this new work culture. So on the one hand, we have a number of new things going on, especially after the pandemic, on the front of a remotization of office work, which I find, I agree with Lizzie in relation to the re-infrastructuring, as in structuring that type of work that platforms do here. We are on one of those who do that very well, Zoom, so eventually. But also the platforming of remote work is really, really evident, I guess, to all of us. But not only that, of course, we have platform work, which we have talked about, and there's plenty of research currently existing. There is push towards anti-work tendencies, which has been very strong, especially in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, thinking about phenomena such as quiet quitting or the Great Resignation. That speaks to a conversation that I find fascinating personally about the connection, sorry for the wordplay here, the connection between disconnection and work, of which Karin has also written. And in the middle of this, we have this object of study, craft, artisanal work, and the new form that this has taken over the last few years, which I find paradoxical, as I said, because on the one hand, it pushes in a sort of nostalgic direction to a more material form of work, but it speaks directly to why people are drawn to a more meaningful work relation and experience. And it doesn't exclude technology altogether, as we are about to see, because technology platforms are one key element in this neo-craftization of artisanal work. This is, well, I'll just skip this as no point, but again, I find that the attempt here is to keep these different new work cultures, as I call them, together. So remote work is one of them. We've talked about platform work and anti-work. I don't really need to engage into this for the sake of time, but we can come back to that in the discussion if there's a necessity. What I find more interesting, however, in this is this sort of the way craft work speaks to practically all of this. why Kraftwerk and why are we talking about its revival eventually? There is an abundant literature that after the first economic crisis of this century, the 2007-2008 crisis, people have turned to craft for a number of reasons, especially out of necessity, but also in the search for a more authentic way of working. This is what Jakob has called the third wave of craft, and digital technologies speak to that because they develop new transnational communities of practice and put people in relation to material production and small sustainable production as well, much more closely. Neocraft work is possibly the most visible example of this kind of return and revival of craft. And the simplest way in which I can describe neocraft work is essentially hipsters. Neocraft work is what concerns forms of production that that essentially go back in time in terms of a more material, small scale and authentic form of both production and work actually, but are connoted by post-industrial imaginary. So we're talking about artisanal coffee roasters, gin producers, craft beer makers, and so on and so forth. And all these types of occupations point into the direction or promise, as the literature describes, a less alienated form of work where, again, materiality is back into the picture and speaks to the new kind of relationship between identity and work that I see as the ultimate output of the research that I'm doing. And I'm not there yet, so we'll see. Maybe this conversation will help me. This is a scheme that gives us a bit of an idea of where neocraft work, of the different tensions that neocraft work is able to illustrate, perhaps, on the side of production and consumption, playing, and again, in many ways, questioning the usual dichotomy of salaried work and entrepreneurship in ways that are similar to platform work, but that point into a different direction. And of course, the tension between manual work and creative work, the latter of which neocraft work is in many ways the prosecution, the continuation in the promise of passionate work that also connoted creative work in the 2000s. So there is a further problem to this, which is what my research is trying to address. That is, we have no data about this. We only have a few sparse and hidden pots of information that that concern the ways in which different local, especially national entities talk about craft work and describe what is and what isn't craft. So in order to find these workers and in order to actually engage in research onto this working population, we turn to digital methods. So the first part of the project has been this, what I call the post-demographic approach on neocraft work, engaging in large-scale data collection from 5 social media platforms, which you see on the screen: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube, starting from 2 hashtags, artisanal and artisan, and engaging into ethnographic content analysis to be able to get to 346 cases. That's what we have in the context of the European Union. That on the basis of a number of criteria, which of course I'm very happy to discuss further if there's time, are now the sample of our qualitative investigation. So we have now moved, and we are hopefully finishing by the summer, the qualitative investigation made of interviews and ethnographic work, fieldwork visits to these spaces and places of work, and talking to the people engaged in this sector, trying to understand eventually the lived experiences of what they do, and what draws to this type of work, the relationship with technology, and among different other things, of course, that are equally at stake. So just to give you a very quick overview, this is the country breakdown of this inquiry, which was largely inspired by grounded theory research. So from the ground up, this is a first geographic distribution of the 346 cases that we found, mostly French. There's also a methodological dimension that explains partly because that partly explains why France and Italy are the most represented here, but there's also an element of cultural reference and resonance of craft into the local context, which somewhat counterbalances this. And you can see there is a long tail up to countries and places where we have seen a lot less of this. The topics, of course, the food economy being the most represented one, but it's not the only one. There is a breakdown of a variety of sectors and industries in which we have been able to find cases of neo-craft work according to the definition that we gave. And I realized now that there is no, I just skipped the definition. I don't know for what reason, just went on. The definition of neo-craft work essentially concerns previously what is traditionally considered as manual, previously considered low status work performed by the working class that is getting to be resignified into status producing activity through the inscription into what Emma Bell and co-authors call a craft imaginary, and is conferred new meaningfulness because of this combination of discursive and material elements that we call discursive materiality. And this discursive element is what platforms bring to the picture. The possibility to be able to display work, products, individual identities, laboratories, workspaces in ways that convey this distinctive way of doing craft work. Which also entails a distinction between, or a continuum, not a distinction in this case, between all the new forms of craft work. We don't see them as alternative or mutually exclusive to traditional craft work. It depends on the breakdown that you have between the discursive and the material component, and the relationship also in terms of a more Sennetian approach. With the work of Richard Sennett here comes to mind in relation to craft and material production. So, of course, we have the sort of archetypal, the craft beer brewer or the mixologist on the one hand, quoting Richard Roseo's work, and traditional potters and ceramists on the other, but we also have ceramists among the neo-crafters and potentially craft beer brewers among the conventional craft workers. It really depends on the breakdown and the emphasis of this combination and intricacy between discursive and material elements and what these bring to the fore. So just going back to this, this is probably interesting to the more geographic crowd here, that is a breakdown of where these 346 cases are located on the scale of a geographic positioning. So mostly these are urban, of course, endeavors, but many of them are not. So we have quite a significant presence as well of non-metropolitan areas, meaning small cities or provincial areas, and also rural areas. More sparsely also in islands and various locations. Various locations is something that we are actually paying a close attention to, because we see some of these endeavors are actually located in multiple countries across Europe, which also brings an interesting element of cross-national movement and flow of work. So what we have found so far, I know I have 3 minutes according to my clock, so I'll do my best to stick to that, probably just extending of a couple more, but not more than 2 or 3 minutes, promise. So first of all, this is a case, and we argue in an article that hopefully will come out in the next few months, this is a case of platform I's work, meaning that is an evidence of how craft work is being eventually influenced by the role that platforms increasingly play within its own context. It happens in 3 ways that we are sketching out so far in this way. One, and I guess the most important, being the idea that this draws neo-craft workers to social media platforms, in particular Instagram, and forces them to be content creators. So even if they don't feel that they want to be a content creator, they feel some kind of distress, they're not skilled for that, but still they have to play that particular role. When they have enough money, perhaps they can outsource this to an agency, but this is counterintuitive to the role that authenticity plays in this context. So they have to be themselves most often, rather than just hiring a marketer to do that because it is perceived as not authentic. There is an interesting twist to the idea of anti-industrial craft work that is connoted to traditional forms of craft. Neo-craft workers actually recognize and incorporate digital technology into their work. And that's why also we see some differences in different platforms. For instance, Etsy is more, which is the platform that one would immediately associate to craft work, is considered as a platform dedicated for people who do craft work on the side of a different or main occupation, and not an actually professional tool as opposed to Instagram. And of course, there is a paradoxical dimension even in the way these appear, because we observe a high level of aesthetic homogeneity of contents. So if these initiatives, these workers also strive to be particular and authentic and actually put themselves on a market through these platforms, ultimately they all look alike. So it's quite different. It's quite difficult to pin one activity from another if you look at their Instagram feeds, which is the byproduct of the role of platforms here, a very direct one, and the standardization of certain types of display, to use the word of John Boy and use the Soitermark, that actually is encoded into certain platforms, and particularly Instagram, which is really the big deal here. I can leave this. If needed, I will come back to that. And the second, and perhaps most important for the title of my talk, the one that I'm trying to rehearse more over these presentations these days, is the strive for meaningfulness, because this taps into a process of exiting wage work that is really aligned to what David Graeber was talking about very early on in the bullshit jobs. This is my timer, in the bullshit jobs book. So many of the people that we talked with are coming out of traditional pathways of work and turning into craft work in the search of meaningful and materiality, and many also in the explicit acknowledgement that it is quite pointless to search for a middle-class job because there are none anymore. And therefore, this type of compromise is what actually makes them more fulfilled, because it gives you the kind of allure of coolness that creative work used to give to people who aspire to become creative workers in the 90s and the 2000s, and the resonance with objects and the matter that actually doing data entry for an advertising company doesn't give them anymore. And again, we have a number of different, we have this other article, which will take a little more time actually, that explains these pathways outside of wage work and into neo-craft work as gradual, lateral, and radical on a sort of growing scale, let's say, of how this has taken place and where this journey, this trajectory of workers from one type of job to another actually has happened. And of course, there is a big role played by trigger events like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also other stuff, travels, experiences, health issues, and ultimately an understanding of climate change, which I guess will become even more important in the years to come. That was really too long. So to finish, the point I'm making is that neo-craft work is kind of a quintessential example of how many workers are looking also through platforms, but to forms of work that are very difficult to actually pin down to the way in which we've thought about work in 20th century industrial society kind of understandings. And I look for alternatives to develop career paths outside of them, and especially outside of the traditionally considered good job that usually is one in the knowledge and creative economy, although it comes from the understanding that this kind of job, and from the experience of others who have found this kind of job precarious, low paid, or generally pointless, or increasingly pointless. Neo-craft work fulfills a particular promise of resonance in that sense, and a sort of new way, a new attempt at developing a middle-class compromise of a job that gives you some money, but also some social status. and social mobility somehow, even if this doesn't necessarily come through money, which is another interesting element. So there is also a point about disconnection that can be made here in relation to, again, disconnecting from traditional work aspirations and pathways and connecting to something else that considers social mobility on the basis of different values altogether. And of course, there are a number of different problems here as well, and questions that are still open. For instance, how quitting is actually creating a bubble of these type of cool jobs, allegedly cool jobs, while these are still labor intensive and often not necessarily well-paid occupations. Who can afford this? Because not everybody can. There is a problem, there is a question about economic capital, of course, and the possibility to afford this kind of switch that is quite strong, and also in relation to gender and age, and as well in relation to the range of professional figures that exist within this context, and how do we qualify them? A bit like platform work. Who are these workers? Are they entrepreneurs? Are they artists? Are they workers, whatever that means in general terms? Certainly not definable, I guess, in the way in which we used to define workers in the context of the industrial economy in the 20th century. And ultimately, there is a role played by geography here, because the axis between urban, what is urban and what is non-urban or rural, is actually very prominent. And I remember, and I'm ending on this, I remember a conversation about this on a related topic with Karin, talking about rural gentrification. And I think this is something that that this type of job is really something that is bringing centrally into the picture, as different lifestyles and the kind of economic implications that these bring are sometimes colonizing in entire areas, coming with a big baggage of material and discursive elements that change the landscape of certain places in quite a significant way. I'll stop here with a picture of my fieldwork, and hoping making everybody envious. And and I am open to questions, and I hope it made sense. And probably I realized I was trying to keep a lot of things into one, but I hope it so was insightful, and I'm happy to answer any doubts you might have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alessandro. Another interesting presentation, and I'm sure that you sparked a lot of thoughts. I for sure had a lot of annotations for both of your presentations so far. Let's take them with us and have just 5 minutes break, and then we will leave the floor to Erica. Okay? See you soon. So Erica, I saw that you tested and it seems to work, right?
Yeah, it was strange though, because I couldn't see the people. So
Aha, you only saw the
yeah.
presentation.
Yeah, but that's something on my own side, I guess. Let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and try it again. Oh, there. Okay, there you are.
Okay, you see us?
Yes. And I'll let's see if I say full screen for the view.
Mhm.
There. There. Does that
Mhm.
work? Okay. Okay.
It's still not full screen, but
Oh, it's not.
no, not on our side at least.
Okay.
It's good enough, but just so you know, it's not
Yeah. Okay. Can you
I mean, it
see?
works this way. Yeah, it sure works.
Okay.
Mhm.
The one thing I'm wondering is, yeah, it's not working on my.
Mhm.
It's not showing my. Well, this is very annoying. It's not going to show my like little things coming in at different times. It's just putting
Aha,
everything in at the same time. So
okay.
I'll just have to do the presenter view. Um, mm, let me just see if this is working now. You get a preview of the
Yeah, we
exciting.
do. It's the teaser
Yeah.
for sure.
Well, no, it's well, I'm gonna have to just do it without my notes, I think. Let's see. I've stopped the share just for a moment.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know how to help you otherwise, since I think that Zoom works differently every time you use it almost.
Yeah,
So
I know. It's okay. I
we are
can't believe by now I don't have a perfect control of this
no, exactly.
technology.
You think you do, but no, not. That's how it is. I think we all recognize it.
Mhm.
So anyway, welcome back, everyone. Our next and final speaker then is Erica, who is now going to talk about something that I've been longing to hear about for a long time, a digital nomad cruise that you recently undertook. So whenever
Thank you.
you're ready, please go ahead and present.
Thanks, Karin, and thanks so much for inviting me. It was really fun to see how the other two presentations connect to what I'm going to talk about today as well. So first of all, my title of the talk, A Global Sense of Workplace, is obviously playing with Doreen Massey's idea. She's really working with this at the beginning of globalization, obviously, and kind of speaking back to people who were trying to do what she said, put fixed places as areas with boundaries around it, instead is trying to say places are open, multifaceted, they are processes and meeting places. And this has always been something that's kind of been foundational in the way I've thought about place, as many people as well. And I really put together this bit at the bottom here, that place or space in Lefebvre's formulation is a social product. It's constituted through both social relations and these kind of intense and dynamic forms of communication. So Oops, there. And so since then, place has really been imagined taking from this in new ways, in terms of how do media and communications help create place. And there's a lot of different work on this. So my own formulation of space and place is really looking at sociality, routines, knowledge, experiences, connectivity, communication, kind of knowing, feeling belonging, how all of these social relations go into place. And so I'll just go ahead and put my thesis statement right up front, which is this idea that although they come from a wide array of professional disciplines, digital nomadism seems to be emerging as a field in itself, a sort of workplace built for the era of flexible labor. My slide is working. There we go. So I'm going to talk a bit about digital nomads. I have done ethnographic work in multiple sites across the kind of digital nomad infrastructure. Mexico City, which has been in the top 10 sites for Nomad List for years. Madera's kind of state-sponsored digital nomad village. And then most recently, a nomad cruise. And to be honest, the nomad cruise is where I'm going to talk today, mostly because that's where a lot of my understanding kind of started to coalesce. Even though, as I learned, the nomad cruise is a particular segment of the digital nomad world. A lot of people, as one participant told me, wouldn't be caught dead on this cruise. So it's not that it reflects perfectly what digital nomadism is, but through talking to people and interviewing people and participating, I learned so much about the rest of the infrastructure. So that's where I'm going to focus today and talk about digital nomadism as a workplace. The subtext through all of this are these theories of place and placemaking in global media and communication contexts, as well as research on digital labor, flexibilization, and the gig economy. Just so often I spend all my time talking about my theoretical framework and don't get time to talk about my data. So I've decided just to tell you that's the subtext, and we've actually heard a lot about these subtexts from the previous speakers today, which is great. So the term digital nomad comes from the late 90s as people were able to kind of work from anywhere. And although there are exceptions to this, historically, this is really a moment where work, location, and work itself are uncoupled. And although this kind of began with home or coffee shops, the digital nomad identity has really evolved to refer to those who have given up their home base in exchange for continuous travel supported by working remotely. So one of the main kind of ways I'm thinking about this is then it's like a work-centric mobile lifestyle. Internet-enabled remote workers who combine work with frequent or continuous travel, visiting locations known for their natural beauty and or vibrant culture, along with, and this is very important, a low cost of living and the availability of strong internet. Oddly, Tokyo is kind of surging right now, which is strange with this low cost of living, but within this infrastructure, it tends to be places that are much cheaper than the wages people are making from wherever their salary is coming from. So what are some of the things we know about digital nomads? It's crazy the amount of research that's come out in just the last 2 years. It's actually very difficult to keep up with. So this is just some highlights, and there's a lot of work that's come out. But mostly we're looking at college-educated Westerners. Their travel is enabled by their strong passports, but also that gap in terms of the cost of living and where they go. Unlike expats, their employment doesn't tie them to the location. That's not why they choose where to go or how long to stay. They really prioritize location independence. That's a major key word in this group. And and these kind of general goals around freedom from commitments to place, to work contracts, to being settled. There's a real anti-settlement discourse. The focus is on mobility, technology, and work. In fact, Cohen et al. Have found that mobility is often one of the main points, and my work has certainly underscored that. COVID-19 became an opportunity to test the lifestyle for a lot of people because of remote work. And right now, there are about 35 million self-declared digital nomads, according to a recent study. I find that should not be something that indicates there are 35 million people that are part of some kind of unified digital nomad community. But that's another thing to talk about. There's this trend toward freelance labor, contract labor, gig labor, or entrepreneurship over full-time corporate employment. Part of that is because a lot of companies have started to do this whole return to the office thing, or have actually recognized the tax implications and intellectual property implications of having your employees outside of the country for more than a certain number of days a year. So there's been this kind of rewind to say, even if you're working remotely, we don't want you out of the country. So that's also been one of the reasons why a lot of people have kind of moved toward self-employment. But self-employment also fits this model of freedom, right? Freedom from constraints. They seek to escape the traditional office atmosphere. And yet labor is incredibly important to people, to their identities. The fact that they work is important, even though a lot of people are working to hopefully not have to work eventually, or to create passive income, or to work less. There's been a rise of digital nomad hubs across the world. People have needed technologically adequate places to work. They need affordable places to work, and yet they need to find a sense of community and belonging. So a lot of that, combined with the need to constantly be networking and improving yourself and your career, have led to the rise of these hubs. A lot of kind of well-known tourist destinations, such as in Bali, Thailand, Vietnam, as well as some new sites of interest, kind of in like Bulgaria, for example, have been reconfigured as digital nomad hubs and populated with this kind of growing network of co-working, co-living spaces. But even when people don't choose co-working or co-living, just because those are a little bit more expensive, adding another layer of expense to people that are already kind of living on a really budget-minded way, the use of these online social networking sites help people find each other and just the fact of being in these sites, right? Being in Chiang Mai, Thailand, for example, you can find the digital nomads. There's certain neighborhoods. Being in Roma Norte in Mexico, you can find each other. To create this kind of consistent belonging, as well as just to share information, there are a lot of different social media and online communities and forums that connect digital nomads from around the world. So I'm sure you've all seen a lot of these articles over the past few years. Here's two very prominent publications, right? The Guardian and the New York Times Magazine, showing people working on the beach with their laptop. This is a really popular way that journalists have to represent this new change in work. And yet these kind of images of being in a pool or on a beach with their laptop really kind of mirror these other narratives that we see of digital labor and the gig economy, such as get paid to do with what you love, that rationalize the uncertainties of precarious work and they normalize its risks. So just so you don't think I picked two publications to show you with the laptop, this is like if you just put a Google image search, digital nomads, this is one screenshot. I could scroll for pages and pages and pages of this. One of the things you see is, of course, that laptop on the beach, laptop with the mountain view. kind of thing. But another thing you'll notice if you look at these pictures is that the digital nomad is so often pictured alone, right? Even on the lower left, if you see the cartoon version, right, they're on a beach alone. And yet, and this kind of brings up this question, right? A lot of times the way that we see digital nomads portrayed and a lot of their own kind of discourse is about this kind of individual life. We talk about the kind of neoliberal individual life project, right? This is in many ways seems to be the apex of this kind of self project, right? And I don't think that's incorrect. And yet researchers have also noticed an increasingly connected kind of digital nomad community and infrastructure popping up in these sites around the world. So I went on this digital nomad cruise for 9 days. 400 of us boarded the cruise from Tenerife in the Canary Islands to Brazil. It was priced lower because the ship is repositioning itself for the winter. So it was super interesting, right? So many of the digital nomads also wanted to reposition themselves for the winter and maybe start off in Brazil and then move to other countries of South America, maybe kind of up to Mexico City, pop into the US at some point toward the end of the winter or spring to visit family if you're American, or move from there somewhere else. So there's sort of a seasonal migration to the warmer places so that you can put your laptop on the beach, I suppose. And so this cruise then pulls together digital nomads. We were not the only people on the cruise. There are about 400 of us, but there were regular cruisers as well. Alessandro, you'll recognize Costa Diadema as the famous Italian ship that went down, the one previous to this, sunken off the island of Giglio quite a few years ago. So this was billed as Design Your Life at Sea, the only traveling conference for digital nomads, but also aspiring digital nomads. So a lot of remote workers took vacation to come on this cruise to see if they wanted to create a digital nomad life, to see if they wanted to launch that career. Entrepreneurs and this kind of weird global freedom seekers, which you wouldn't believe how many people seem to identify in that way. So one of the things I noticed right off is digital nomad is really a group identity, and prioritizing work is key to the group. So as much as we talk about it as an individual thing, a lot of people, when I interviewed them, the first thing I'd say is, are you a digital nomad? And so many people were like, kind of, yes, I suppose. I don't really like that title. But it turns out it's just a really useful title for finding the other people doing what you're doing, right? So this person that I interviewed, I hate to use the term digital nomad, but I'm here and I have gone to digital nomad destinations. At the very first part of the cruise, we had a welcome event where an organizer of the event kind of emceed the welcome and told us this story where she said years ago, before her first digital nomad cruise, she was at a hostel for a few days and she felt really out of it because all the backpackers were off hiking, having fun together. She says, I was there working on my laptop, stressed out. I didn't feel like I belonged there. But then on the last night before the cruise, I looked up in the common area and like 5 other people were on laptops. I yelled out, digital nomads, and they were like, yes. And I went back to work knowing I had found my community, right? And so this idea that the digital nomads is actually a group, right? It is actually some kind of community or work-based community. This woman I interviewed said, when I see people who don't have a job and are using the term digital nomad, I'm like, no, you are just traveling, right? And so it is a very work-focused thing. That's my time. Wow. So a few of the things I noticed on the cruise, the digital nomad field has experts, expertise, shared jargon, right? You have a lot of people who are known as the podcasters, right? As the influencers in this space. They get the roles in the conference at the Digital Nomad Cruise, right? They're sharing their knowledge. People know them, they want to talk to them. There is a circuit of top sites, conferences, workshops, festivals. So this cruise is just one of the things. From the very beginning, in line to board the cruise, I heard people saying, oh, I haven't seen you since Bansko, or how was Nomad Base, or did you know, like there's this kind of geographical series of events and festivals that bring people together. For example, the organizers of Nomad Cruise are actually hosting a Nomad Base in Spain in the spring, where they say, come for a whole month, right? Come work remotely, but know that we're all going to be there, right? There are a lot of, there's a lot of knowledge sharing among peers. For example, one woman who is a graphic designer told me how her peers in Thailand that she met at kind of a digital nomad community there taught her how to use Upwork so that she could stop teaching English and become a digital nomad who funded herself through graphic design. These locations are, interestingly, they're important as sites for work and tapping into the network much more for any kind of anthropological or cultural reasons connected to the places. I have an example of that here. So out of 80 unconferences that were pitched during the Nomad Cruise, 2 of them had something to do with Brazil or South America. One of those was a talk about the Amazon rainforest and some activism around protecting it. And one of them was some bachata lessons. And then out of 70 official conference presentations, none of them had anything to do with Brazil or South America. These were about how to get into crypto, how to monetize your Instagram, YouTube, or podcast, how to launch your business with remote clients, right? It was all very work focused, even though we were on our way to this particular place, right? And in fact, one of the one of the really enjoyable interviews was somebody who was really upset with this, right? And telling me his feelings. And we had met at this Amazon rainforest talk. He said, you and I went to that Amazon talk, but there were like 5 people. And then the crypto thing is like fucking 50 people. And he's like, what happened here, right? So this was really the focus. There's a real valorizing of spiritual and physical wellness. So a lot of yoga, ecstatic dance, money mindset, right? If you have certain relationship beliefs and certain kind of transcendental beliefs, money will just come to you. A lot of it reminded me of Silicon Valley, although we kind of here we're in this post-Silicon Valley moment. And so in a way, this also shows you how Silicon Valley has dispersed perhaps in a way that's very logical in a flexible workspace. They too are grappling with workplace discrimination and diversity issues. There was one really fabulous conference talk from a woman of color and an African-American associate of hers who talked about discrimination in the digital nomad community. So they've kind of had to take it upon themselves to just convince people to recognize this as a problem. And then just finally, the flexibility is key with everybody I was talking to. The way they build their lifestyles as digital nomads is incredibly flexible. If you have a big contract, you get a better Airbnb or you join a better gym, right? If you have a light month, you switch to a worse Airbnb, right? You stay at a worse place. You don't go to the co-working space, right? And so the flexibility and the scalability of this lifestyle is really important. So I'll just conclude with a few thoughts. They may seek to escape the office, but digital nomads have reproduced a workspace or a workplace over an emerging global infrastructure. It is perfectly fit to the flexible work practices and flexible office designs of the gig era. And I'm adopting this global sense of workplace because the digital lifestyle can then be understood less as this radical departure by professionals from office life, right? Not just a bunch of people who somehow are making money on a beach with their laptop, but more as a logical next phase in digital labor at the time when the supposed kind of golden era of Silicon Valley is coming to an end. I'll stop there, and I want to apologize because of having to do presentation mode. I couldn't have my notes. So hopefully that all made sense, and I look forward to talking to everybody more.
That went impressively well, I would say, without the notes. Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you all for your presentations. And so now we have about half an hour if we want to have the discussion and questions. So if you just indicate if you have a question by raising your hand, or you can also write it in the chat and I will see it. Maybe you also have comments and questions to each other, the presenters. Yes, Cornelia?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself as always. Thank you for a really great panel and great presentations. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading also about your more about your project. I have a question probably for everyone, but first for Alejandro. I was wondering if you in your research have also addressed the question of how the neo-craft workers deal with the kind of the post-digital or the longing for digital disconnection that you in the beginning said they have, and the dilemma of then having to use the digital platforms and do a lot of digital labor, then also to promote the products they are crafting. Yeah.
Shall I?
Yes, that's appropriate, I think, Alessandro, if you respond first, please.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That's very true. It's more than a dilemma in many ways. It's a struggle that they find. Of course, not all of them. There is a variety of positions, at least through the ones that we have interviewed. But they feel that this is a necessary evil for their work, and that's not what they have come to do craft work for in the first place. So their idea was to engage with material work and find resonance, to use Armut Rosa's concept here. That's I guess, if you want to sort of summarize it, the main takeaway, the main drive for them to craft work, but they find that they cannot really escape that particular dimension. And they have to do it in certain ways in order also to be recognized as part of these industries, which are very much what Sharon Zukin would call a symbolic economy. And therefore, the display of products of themselves and their self-branding within this context is also something that is necessary for them to do in order to be well off professionally. And then on top of that, there's Liz's point, which is really, a case here of application of how the platform becomes the workplace and the infrastructure for them. And the paradoxical dimension here, I think, is that none of this is what they think is their work. So we kind of have the most paradoxical dimension in the fact that if you think about craft work, this is not the kind of activity that comes to mind in the first place. And still platforms and the whole digital laboring dimension is there.
Thanks.
Can I make a comment to Lizzie?
Yeah, please continue.
It was so nice to hear your presentation, and I felt like there were a lot of great ways that it supported what I was thinking about with digital nomads. But I was thinking a little bit at the end when you were talking about the why this matters and the social aspect. And it seems to me that LinkedIn became more of a social network after COVID. And And I just wondered, I know a lot of the work you were talking about was more the kind of mobile gig workers, like food delivery people. But it is interesting too to think about these platforms and the sociality and the way that sociality has changed, right? Once professional workers didn't have that workplace, that physical workplace. I guess it's a comment more than a question, but I didn't know if anyone else had noticed that about LinkedIn.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of vaguely aware, but I think I was just thinking about this idea of kind of post-pandemic work cultures, and I think one of the things that people noticed, as well as, for example, this rejection of work or anti-work, it was also a recognition that work is social, and so I think this is as in people missed social interaction in going to a specific workplace site. And I think that, I mean, this is one, you could say, result of that, or it's a kind of related implication of it, I guess, that this thing that was solely seen as kind of professional somehow moves into being more private or social, or yeah.
Yes, Magnus, I see you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, the three of you, for very interesting presentations. And I have a question for Elizabeth. I think it taps into what Erika asked. I appreciated the pinpointing of both platform and infrastructure. And infrastructure is such a, I almost said, and I said, buzzword, because you can apply it to almost everywhere. And I also admit that I've used that sometimes when you're not exactly sure about something, that you can call it an infrastructure. But in these, you were talking about it, about the flexibility requires a focus on infrastructure. And then you said it's the tech and the materials that enact processes and practices that enable circulation and so on. But then how infrastructure, sometimes you talk about the social infrastructure and not only the sort of infrastructure, the material one and so on. How can we sort of, how can we relate to that? The fussiness of infrastructure, the concept per se, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, big question. I mean, on the one hand, I think infrastructure in the way that it was presented in my presentation, but I think also in the way that some people have approached it, is it's a different way of talking about social structure, actually. So it's a way of, yes, it's a way of talking about social structure that emphasizes, for example, materials, technologies, and so on. But it's also a way of thinking about, for example, the hidden work that creates what appears to be a social structure, or the kind of contingencies or insecurities and so on in a given kind of social structure. So, I mean, I think from my perspective, there are different ways of kind of thinking about it, but infrastructure is always social. Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, how is a road social? Well, I mean, you can answer that in different ways, right? But I agree. I mean, there is this specific phrase, kind of the social infrastructure of something, and this, I mean, this depends on how it's being used in that particular context. But yeah, I mean, I think it's rather than, I mean, which is what I was trying to do in the presentation, and it's not enough I mean, it's also not hugely important, I guess, in the end, the different kind of approaches to infrastructure, but rather than saying infrastructure means a single thing, it is to emphasize actually this kind of plurality of understandings. But I think also this is a bit why it is a buzzword at the moment. It's because it has this kind of material element, but it also does something that is a bit different from structure. Yeah. I don't know whether you want to come back, because I know that's not a kind of completely direct response. And I mean,
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
Yes, I do. Yes. Then it's implying a social material perspective, and then and that's the thing to focus on yeah, it's a good answer. Yes.
I can actually follow up, because I had a similar question, I guess, but I think you have already answered it, Lizzie, so you don't have to do it again. But I had a question about the methodological implications of recognizing something as an infrastructure, recognizing the workplace as an infrastructure. What does that mean for where we need to look and what things we expect to see? But I think it was included in your reflection now as well. And apart from that, I had also maybe a comment to Alessandro. I think your presentation was also super interesting, and it also touches upon a lot of thematic that I'm myself trying to figure out. And I think that all of you more or less are also talking about matters of social stratification and distinction and what becomes valuable in this digitalized age or post-digital age. And I was just thinking while you were talking, Alessandro, about the most recent, or one of them, debates in Sweden right now that has to do with technology and the discussion about screen time. And that is how kids in Sweden right now, they are becoming less and less skilled in doing craft work, of working with scissors and like using their hands for something else than just scrolling through their phones, basically. So I was also just wondering if you think that the value of craft work and the augmented value of craft work also has not only to do with the digital condition per se, but also those kinds of things. Like it's becoming an increasingly scarce resource, apparently, judging from those kinds of research reports coming in about kids' skills in various ways. Yeah, if you want to just reflect upon that, or more generally also the rising value of craft work and the reasons for it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there is the generational component, if I can just rephrase the comment here, if I am allowed, I think is quite important, because the vast majority of those that apparently come into our radar are from a quite specific, actually, generational cohort, which is what we call millennials. So there is a sense of having spent, for many of these people, having spent part of their lives in front of technology that didn't give them any meaning back. And now they're searching for something else. Now, of course, there is this paradoxical element of the platform-related understanding, which is inescapable, but at the same time, the real sort of drive for them is to, again, get away from that particular position of cog in the machine, that similar to what was at the switch, in a sort of way, in a switch from the industrial to a post-industrial phase we are seeing right now, and in a sort of exhaustion of in relation to digital technology. But it's also because of a generational dimension, I guess, because of the labor market. So it's difficult to actually pin down where this is at. It would be curious to see this in 10, 15, 20 years, I'm probably passing on to somebody else, not me, but to see whether, you know, generations who have been socialized to an extent very, very earlier than the millennials here, the millennials cohort, actually have this same search for nostalgic ways of working or kind of old practices that involve their hands. And there is in terms of meaning, there is also a wider sort of conversation that also I pointed to when I spoke about the demise of middle-class jobs, because those jobs that they are exhausted from are the same that they crave for in the search for this sort of middle-class lifestyle that they are unable to achieve. So at some point, the labor-intensive version, but cool version that is given by, you know, doing the mixologist or the craft brewer is attractive because, yeah, I mean, I work hard, but at the end of the day, it's cool. That's what they're looking for as well. So there's plenty of contradictions that I'm trying to make sense of as a part of the full picture. I don't know if this answers the question at all.
Yeah, it was a good reflection, I think. So thank you, Peter, and then Lizzie, I think.
Yeah, thank you all three for really interesting presentations. I wanted to go back to the issue raised by Lizzie on agency, which Alessandro also alluded to when discussing exit by workers from dull jobs. And kind of thinking about coming more from a labor geography perspective to like digital workplaces. And also with the discussion of digital nomadism, to what extent do the old collective interest representations for workers, say trade unions or collectives, how do these still function or not function, or what are the opportunities or barriers for those in the new digital economy? Because there's quite a lot of lots of changes. You also, all presentations also mentioned the emphasis on individualism, which is kind of antithetical to those kind of more collective organizations. I'm kind of curious if you see a future for old ways of articulating workers' interests, or how these could be modified.
Yes, who wants to? I think that was directed to Lizzie, but also perhaps all presenters.
Well, I will not give an overarching answer to that question, but it actually relates a bit to what I wanted to also kind of say or propose. I mean, yes, I was also reflecting on the kind of I mean, obviously in the presentation that I gave, but also in the other two, I think there was a kind of emphasis on individuals. But one thing that I wanted to kind of say and kind of pose as a question, because I think this relates to the way in which we think of working culture, or have thought of working culture, obviously in certain geographical contexts, through this idea of a working class culture and trade unions, for example. And I think that particularly, I don't know so much in my presentation, but particularly in the other two presentations, that the approach was really one of kind of cultural analysis, and to say, okay, what are the kind of working cultures that we see emerging in this contemporary era? And of course, we're not talking, I mean, there are still trade union cultures. And to say cultures is different from necessarily, or it's not the same as talking about the politics of trade unions. It is related, but it's so I just sort of wanted to reflect on that, because I think it's interesting and also probably important. But I think when I talk about work culture, often the response is, well, yeah, I mean, how is this political? Or, you know, what are the politics of this? And I was wondering whether the other two speakers have any response to that. Yeah, and just two specific things. So to Erica, if there's time for this, I was just interested, who were the staff who are working on the cruise? who are not the digital nomads. Like if you kind of reflected on that, or whether there was anything interesting in that, I guess. And then secondly, to Alessandro, I was just thinking, it's interesting, the figure of craft work, as it were, comes up again, because this was also in post-Fordism, right? This kind of flexible accumulation, the re-emergence of craft work. And yeah, I mean, I guess you've thought about this much more than I have, but yeah, I was just wondering whether you have a kind of reflection on that. And I wanted to say, there was also, there's a book called Filter World, How Algorithms Flattened Culture, that I think is coming out now, later this year. I don't think it's written by an academic, but I read a kind of long read journal, a long read kind of newspaper piece about this, and it was very interesting, kind of talking about this kind of the reinforcement of a certain aesthetic in co-working spaces, in hipster coffee shops, which is really reproduced through the necessity to kind of market a particular image, for example, of, you know, the coffee cup and so on. And your talk really reminded me of this from a kind of more academic standpoint.
Good
Sorry,
questions
I
and
didn't take that
reflections.
much space.
No, it's
I'll say a little something about the political question, Lizzie, because I think, because I didn't have my notes, I was kind of going that way in terms of a lot of the discussion among these nomads is this is going to be normal someday. This is the future of work. There's a real sense of being at the forefront of something. And on the other hand, of course, what we know is that this forefront that they're on is one we've seen before, right? Which is kind of an extraction economy where you go to a place and you know, from your point of privilege, and take something that helps you more maybe than the local community. But if we think about this as what the next logical step would be, it's of course that people in these communities who are interacting with also start to get the same jobs, right? And at some point, the salary gap goes away, because the people paying out are going to say, I don't care that you're a Westerner, I'm not giving you more money than this local person for the same work. So I think we're looking at a particular moment that someday a certain sector of folks are going to look back on as the good old days, no matter how precarious their work is right now. And I assume that next step has to lead to some sort of organizing. I don't know what it's going to be yet, and I haven't seen a lot of implications of it. Quickly on the staff, the nomad cruise people, there's a small staff, maybe 3 or 4, maybe, that were clearly paid to run the nomad cruise, but then the cruise itself had a lot of staff. One day I was lost on the boat, and it's a very big boat, and I'm looking around and I see a door, and I realize I've ended up in a staff area, and I see a door that says, "You are now entering the guest area, smile, you are on stage," right? And so there was like, that was a really kind of gross feeling. And a lot of people on the cruise liked to say, the nomads like to say things like, oh, the staff, it's like a modern form of slave labor. I mean, that there was this thing, and then they'd go on and like go to ecstatic dance class or something. So there was a very strange gap when you ask about staff in terms of how Nomad Cruise was staffed and how the boat was staffed. Anyway.
Reminds of Triangle of Sadness, if you haven't seen.
I know, it reminded me a lot.
But yeah, cruise ship
Like,
hierarchies.
I didn't fall off the boat or anything.
No, luckily.
Or
Okay, Alexandre,
separate
yeah.
for those who have seen the series. But anyway, whatever. Lizzie, can you please say again the name of the book? Because I was listening, but I didn't catch the reference, please.
Yep, I can also put it in the chat because it might be of interest. It's called filter world, how algorithms flattened culture.
Thank you.
Mm.
I'll start briefly from the previous point of Peter. There is no real collective dimension here. The neo for neocraft stands also for neoliberal form of craft work. I'm afraid to say that. So, which means the very sort of individual element is there as a solution for the failure of the collective ones, if you see what I mean. That's an interesting question, because they perceive themselves, many of them, they perceive to be part of a bigger thing, of a bigger reappropriation, so to speak, of one's life, as opposed to what the sort of the structuring of work as it used to be, and the vexation that this came with that. I guess digital nomads, linking to Erica's presentation, have quite similar views, I would imagine, in relation to finding a more balanced relationship with their life and prioritizing their life somehow more than their work. I guess that's as collective as it gets here, other than being part of a cool scene, but I don't think this can be considered as trade unionism of any kind. But still, there is probably a kind of communitarian element, at least in some of these value descriptions and discussions, but definitely not a collective one of sorts. Going back instead to Lizzie's point, there is craft, like nostalgic waves of sort of different things also of craft. There are plenty, so there have been before. I think the two elements that are particularly peculiar to this one are, as opposed to previous ones, this is not anti-technological. So the anti-industrial does no longer overlaps with the anti-technological. Technology is not the enemy here. It's standardization, if you see what I mean, which is also paradoxical because the standardization that they do on Instagram is pretty evident, but that's a different point. It's a kind of contradictory relationship, I guess, there. And also, it is in the element of novelty here is, this is also, in a way, changing how do we conceive of craft? While previously craft was somewhat a fixed, static object, and it came back to bring something at some point, and people will find some form of relationship with craft, but craft was something that didn't change. Now what we're looking at is the ways in which this signifier, if you want to take that, although it's not necessarily just that, this imaginary, the actual definition is this imaginary of craft is actually superimposed onto working class jobs. I think that's the sort of the key element here, so that we are seeing this imaginary travel to somewhere else. And this brings a discursive element into play that was not there before in previous waves. The most similar one was probably the sort of contiguity between craft and the creative economy, and the more craft side of the whole creative industries, literature and debate. But still, that entailed primarily hobbyists, not people in actual occupational endeavors, or at least not primarily so. While these are people who quit their job for a new life, in this sort of first iteration, or the sort of closer to the creative economy kind of the sort of literature that, for instance, Susan Luckman has been very insightful about, that mainly is people who are doing craft on the side and develop, out of the passion kind of literature, I would say. I don't know if that makes sense at all. I think that these are the sort of features that I see peculiar to this, and why it's closer, perhaps, again, paradoxically, to things like remote work and nomad work than to other things.
Thank you, Alessandro. I think it will be the last question now, Magnus. You get to pose it.
Okay, thank you. What an honor.
Yes.
It's a question for Erika. And maybe it's touched upon the other presentation as well. I was thinking of these lifestyle projects which very often include mobility of some kind, and then how you sort of, the documentation is part of it. You can when you're stepping out of a rat race, you buy a cabin and then you start an Insta account in order to not only restore not only to repair the cabin, but also document it and share it. And digital nomads, I always thought about them as global remote workers, but you also mentioned influencers there. So they also consider themselves as digital nomads. Then, because I was thinking that's quite a big difference when it comes to the work aspects of work. And is it also people that are doing both, sort of are working and then using this their style of life as also to make money as well? Or how do you, that kind of relation between influencers and remote workers?
Yeah, and I didn't mean necessarily all influencers, but there's this big sector in digital nomadism of nomad influencers, travel influencers, and I'd written about this in a few years ago in the Routledge companion to Media and Class that I edited, just to make a plug, that there's almost like a pyramid scheme, right, around the lifestyle. So there's one huge sector of digital nomads that are selling the digital nomad lifestyle to other digital nomads. So that's one of the influencer types is you can sign up for my remote course, my webinar, my YouTube channel, buy my book, follow my podcast or whatever that teaches you how to be a digital nomad. And so those people are really showing how wonderful it is, right? And so that's a kind of type of influencer, only they're also selling content. So content creators, but then there really are other just influencers. There was a woman on the cruise who gave a talk that she makes $225,000 a year on her Instagram as a travel Instagrammer. So there are people doing this. Of course, they're selling this dream that very few people can achieve, and yet the dream becomes so important as a kind of ideological narrative and motivator to embarking on the lifestyle. I will tell you, I've interviewed over the last few years a lot of digital nomads on Zoom in the places where they're staying, and their backgrounds do not look exotic or beautiful or in any way like the content we see. People are living on a shoestring budget and they're just staying in the most affordable place they can.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we will have to leave it at that. I would have loved to continue for another hour or so, for sure. But thank you so much, Lizzie, Alessandro, Erika, for wonderful presentations. And thanks to all of you for your questions and comments and for being here. I hope that you will have a look at our next speaker series event coming up. Cornelia, would you like to say something about that before we just end, or?
Sorry, I can do that. That it's on. The next one is on site, and our guest will be Natasha Webster from Örebro and Stockholm University. But I can't tell you yet what she will talk about because she didn't send me her topic yet. So she's a cultural geographer, and she's also doing geomedia research. It will be in that area, but I don't know which project of hers she will present at the next one. And it's the date. Yeah, that was in May. I have to look in my calendar. Good that we are online. It's May the 6th.